Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Hello, good evening and welcome to the Late Late Show. My name is Kathryn Taylor and I'm really excited to be here tonight with my guest, Dr. James Mannion. We'll be discussing James's new book, Making Change Stick, which is out now, published by John Catt. And I can't recommend this highly enough. It's really, really good. And I've just thought it was such a breath of fresh air. I'm just going to introduce you, James. You are a keynote speaker, teacher, trainer, researcher, consultant, and author with a passion for educational and political reform. You are the co-founder and director of Rethinking Education, a teacher training organisation specialising in implementation and improvement science, which I love the idea of implementation science, by the way, and self-regulated learning and practitioner inquiry. You were a teacher for 12 years and you have an MA in person-centred education from the University of Sussex and a PhD in self-regulated learning from the University of Cambridge. You are also a podcast host as well. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I feel like you need to draw a breath after that. I need to maybe edit my bio down a little, but yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, all of that is true.
No, that's really brilliant. And we're here tonight to talk about your book, which I have read. And I was just saying to you before we started, when I started reading it, I just thought, yes, this is the stuff we need. This is absolutely the stuff that we need. Because you will have noticed, and I'm certainly aware, that there's often a gap in between what we see in research in terms of what we would say is best practice or desirable practice or what should be done to actually get the best outcomes for our learners. But there's a big gap between that and what happens. And, I wonder if we could just start by thinking about, what drew you to this topic? What's made you go for this area?
Yeah. So it was pure happenstance. It was so I was doing a PhD. This journey began for me in 2014. I know the exact date. It was July the 28th, 2014. In the summer holidays, I guess it must have been. And I happened to be in university, and I was a distance student, so I wasn't there very often. But I happened to be there on the same day as this conference called Implementing Implementation Science. And then the strapline was there's something like the science of implementing like positive lasting change in real world context. And that was very much on my mind at the time. My PhD was in the process of scaling up from what was a small initiative that involving 1 year group to is essentially becoming like a whole school approach to teaching and learning. And so scaling up, and this idea of real world context was on my mind. And I thought, there's a science. Wow, there's a science that's going to help me in my quest. And so I decided to pop my head in the door. And it was just one of those, I say one of those, these things don't happen very often, but it was like a jaw on the floor, scribbling notes madly all day. And the keynote speaker that day, one of the keynote speakers was Dr. Barbara Kelly, who's an educational psychologist based up at the University of Strathclyde. And she was the editor of the Handbook of Implementation Science for Psychologists in Education. So it's very much like, it's really a health discipline, and hence the way that psychologists have sort of got into it. It's more of like a public health initiative. And so I started reading about it that day and just got really into it and discovered that there's an implementation science journal, and it's a health journal. Just, it's all medical stuff, but I could immediately see that there were just huge lessons to learn from for education. And there was one super alarming statistic that I came across. It might even have been that day, because people talk about this a lot in the world of implementation science, whereby in healthcare, people are very concerned with the question of to what extent is what we know to be best practice, gold standard, randomized, controlled, trialed, established, gold standard practice, to what extent is that actually happening in the real world, in the wild, as it were? And so to the extent that we can answer that question, researchers have been out into hundreds of hospitals, healthcare centers all over the world. And the finding, the answer to that question is really alarming. So the statistic is that it takes 17 years on average. So people talk about that figure, the 17-year lag, to achieve 14% uptake across the healthcare system as a whole, which is alarming. And I've since checked this. My brother is a brain surgeon, amazingly, and I was just like, "Is this real? This statistic seems just too ludicrous." And he was like, "No, that's my experience as well." And what that means is that should you find yourself in a hospital for whatever reason, there's a very good chance that you're going to be receiving a suboptimal treatment, even though better treatments are out there. And it's not for want of trying. It's like people find these studies and then they publish them in prestige journals. They they put them into national guidelines. They run CPD courses. They try to do whatever they can to train people in these approaches. And for whatever reason, it just often doesn't catch on, and people default back to a sort of substandard status quo. So as soon as I came across it, I was like, this is super fascinating, first of all, just like intellectually, emotionally almost. Like, why is this problem happening? And it's been happening for years. If you think back to like when we discovered that hand washing saves lives, it took about 100 years for that to actually be widespread. So it has a long history. But I could also see, like, in terms of improving outcomes for kids, which is of course what we're all trying to do, I thought there's huge lessons to learn. And so that was the spark that day. Just as one more thing, I scored in my pad that day. I wrote in capital letters, "When you finish your PhD, get into implementation science. This is the bomb." And 4 years later, I did do just that. And we could maybe get into what happened next.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talk about the statistics and the 17-year lag between kind of best practice, gold standard practice, and what, the research says. And of course, there are structural barriers around that as well. Of course, things cost money, and, people need to upskill and all of those things. But it's also really hard to change people's behavior, isn't it? And, one of the other pretty shocking statistics that you mention in your book is that something like 20% of interventions in schools actually secure sustained improvement for pupil outcomes. 20%, and that's being generous.
I actually think that's very generous. So chapter 1 of the book is called "The Mind-Blowing Question," and I've asked this question whenever I do training on this. I often lead with this question. If you look back over your career, and I wonder if anyone's watching or listening live would like to chat and stick an answer in the comments. If you look back over your career, what proportion of change initiatives would you say actually improved anything in a lasting way? And often people, it's really remarkable that the answer often comes back in the 10 to 20% range. But then if you really push people and you say, I'm talking about demonstrable gains, so you've got some evidence that things got better. You've got a sense of causality. So like you know more or less what it is that you did or perhaps stopped doing that led to those gains. And those gains were sustained over several years and are still happening now. And then you ask people again, what's your figure? And at that point, people almost always revise it down to sort of between 0 and 5%, 0 and 10%, or they say, I can't even think of anything, or they maybe point to 1 or 2 things and they say, oh, like read, write, ink. I think that's probably really effective, but maybe it's not happening everywhere yet to the extent that it could, or something like that. So it's like the evidence for things that meet those criteria are actually like hen's teeth. And the reason that I call that the mind-blowing question is that A, like the figure's so low, B, everybody knows it. Like you ask people that question and just before they even say anything, just the non-verbal tics in the body language tells you everything. People laugh, they roll their eyes, they look at each other, and it's also mind-blowing because this does not seem to stop people from rolling out the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, whether that's government, Ofsted, exam boards, mat leaders, senior teams, what have you. All this churn and change coming down the track, and most of it doesn't actually improve things. And so it's yes, absolutely, it's an alarming situation to find ourselves in.
It definitely is, and without spoiling the end, you do kind of at the end of the book you give an example about how many years lost, how many years it would have taken, how much wasted resources is going into all of this. And, but we are all people that want to make a difference, and we are all people that do have the best of intentions. And of course, we work within a structure and that changes around us. And I think, it's fair to say that one of the biggest challenges as well in sustaining implementation is sort of staff turnover and how long it would be before the individual who started the intervention would leave, and how long it would be before half the staff had changed and all of the staff had changed. So it's bigger than the intervention itself. I think that's the core message. Whatever we're doing, it has to be a whole system of processes and structures, because otherwise you just, the odds are not in your favor.
No, right. And I think it's important to recognize that I don't think we should be too hard on ourselves. Sometimes when I talk about this stuff, people get a bit down and they're like, oh, so we don't make a difference, and that doesn't feel great. And actually, teachers and school leaders make a difference every single day just by turning up and doing what we do, right? Like education is a beautiful thing. It's about human flourishing, and at its best, it's about human flourishing and growth and development and so on. But we're talking here about systemic improvements, so like improving outcomes in such a way that that outcomes are better for current and future cohorts than they were before. And if you think about just personal development, like in terms of your own life, if I try to, the New Year's resolution syndrome, right? Like if you try to read more novels or, eat less donuts in staff meetings, whatever it might be, you can sort of keep it going for a little while. Like we're just in February, like there's a stat in the book about a study that Strava did, the exercise app, who analyzed something huge database, millions and millions of data points. And they found that it's like January the 19th is Quitters Day, they call it, when most people give up on their New Year's resolutions. And you get this, that's true of myself as well. You get this little graph from Strava. I got one for about 2 years ago. And there's all these spikes in January and then just like crickets for the whole rest of the year. So I'm not immune to this myself. And so if it's hard enough to implement change in your own life, then thinking about how to implement change in something as complex as a school, if you think about how diverse a staff room is, we don't need to list all the different characteristics, but, full-time teachers, part-time teachers, teachers who love their subject, teachers who are really in it for like more holistic, like personal development, helping the kids to become more confident and oracy and all of that stuff. And so it's hard, this stuff. And so I don't think that we should be too harsh on ourselves. But as Leela, I'm going to pronounce your name, I hope I got it correctly in the chat there, just said, there's so much change in education. Sometimes it seems like we go round in circles, and that's not a nice feeling, is it? There's that sense of, like Michael Fullan calls it initiative-itis, that sort of sense of just, oh, really? There's this, or sometimes people call it this too shall pass syndrome, this phrase that sometimes teachers sort of mutter under their breath as the latest wheeze is announced. This too shall pass. Just keep your head down. Look busy. Yeah. If anyone comes around with a clipboard, look like you're complying with whatever this latest thing is, but you don't actually have to take it on board because it's probably not going to, no one will mention it next year. And that, lots of people in education and beyond education are very familiar with that dynamic.
Yeah, sort of fad fatigue, isn't it? And people think, someone's reinventing the wheel and calling it a hexagon, and it's not actually moving us forward. So I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that's part of it. And I wonder, before we move into the nuts and bolts of the strategy, could you just say a little bit more about why you're using, or why others have used this word science to talk about implementation, and what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one of those things that I wouldn't ideally call it like so there's two fields. So like my entry into this world was implementation science, as you mentioned, and then there's this other related field called improvement science. And so implementation science is really about like scaling up best practice, like that medical issue that we saw earlier. We know what improves outcomes. Let's say it's like asthma is really bad. It's just like get kids to take their asthma medication. That's going to stop them having to go to hospital down the line. So we know what works, but they're not using their medication. How can we scale up its use? So that's a classic implementation science problem. Improvement science comes earlier in the process, which is much more about sort of iterating and trialing ideas and just trying to get a bit better and taking a user-centered, focused view and sort of doing these little things called PDSA cycles, plan, do, study, act, which is like these rapid improvement cycles, and it's all very data-driven. And the scientific process is at work there, right? So we talk a lot about like data in this book, in this program, the Making Change Stick program, and research questions and evidence and so on. So we sort of use like the language of science, if you like, and there are elements of the scientific method, but also, social science is what it is really. And it's not like social science is not anything like natural science, because we're dealing with complex adaptive systems which don't behave in predictable ways. Often you get funny little feedback loops and there's like non-causal outcomes.
It's difficult to isolate things as well, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can't isolate variables, which is one of the reasons that I find the use of RCTs, randomized controlled trials in education, very problematic, because they assume that you can sort of just like change one thing and everything else is somehow controlled, and that's not the case. And so I use the word science, but the ideas in the book and in this program. So the book is a book of a program that I've been trialing in schools and refining and tinkering with quite intensively over the last 6 years or so. But there's ideas there from another science, political science, behavioral science, but also psychology, sociology, things like flow research is really interesting when you think about how teams work together. So there's a wide range of ideas, lots of ideas from business. Often business and manufacturing and so on and industry are way ahead of schools in terms of organizational learning and professional learning. But I'm not massively comfortable with that use of the word science, just because it's so much more messy than that. And when I talk about this, I often call it the art and science of implementing school improvement, because there's a bit of science in there, but it's also a bit of just like getting in and living it and breathing it and playing around and trying things out.
No, that's really brilliant to have that sort of idea. And I think that, when we are thinking about the sciences, the social sciences in particular, it has to be much more mixed methods, if you like. And we do need to sort of think about, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're going to check. I should just remind our viewers that we are here tonight talking to James Mannion about his new book, brought to you from John Catt, and it's Making Change Stick, and it's available at johncatbookshop.com, where you can explore a full range of titles there as well. But this is a particularly good one, and I highly recommend it.
They're both the same one. My own book is with them.
No, I was so excited because I've been working with a PDF version to do my research, and I was so happy when the actual one arrived yesterday. So thank you very much. You mentioned just now that there's a lot of things going on in healthcare, and there's a lot of things going on in business, and I wonder if you have any insight or comment on why it might be the case that education really is just starting to pick this up now, or would you say it's always been there but in a different guise? I guess the statistics suggest not so much. So what do you think about that?
It's a really interesting question, and the honest answer is that I don't know. I don't really have good data on that question. Why is it like when I was doing all of this research? So essentially, there's been two phases to this. One was reading all of this change management literature from all these wide-ranging fields, like I say, and then secondly was like trying to cut through the jargon. And the language is a huge problem in the change management literature, and to try to present this in a sort of a synthesis of all of these ideas. And then the second phase has been trying this out in real schools all over the world, hundreds of them. And often you come across ideas, like probably the two most obvious examples are comms planning, communications planning, and project management, which are just like absolute staples in almost any other walk of life, in politics, in the charity sector, in business, in healthcare to some extent, although healthcare has got some way to travel as well. I often talk to a senior team and they're like, what's a comms plan? It's just not in the language of school leadership. We're not taught about this stuff. That's a big part of the problem. Is, we could maybe talk about that. Chapter 2 of the book is like, why is this improvement, this actual improvement rate so low? But why is it that education is so far behind the curve compared to other areas? As I say, around project management as well. I mean, I could speculate a bit. I suppose there's one idea is that there's just this constant churn, like we were talking about, like Lila talked about, the constant churn, the constant implementation. There's just like this sense of like, it sometimes feels like the only constant is constant change, and you never really get to sort of to get your heads around anything. And I remember as a science teacher, as you said, I taught science for a long time. And I remember do you remember APP, assessing pupil progress, this sort of crazy approach to assessment came in about the mid 2000s.
Was that the 20-minute progress thing?
Well, it was around the same time. So Ofsted were looking for 20 minutes of progress, but APP was this system of like grids within grids within grids of assessment criteria. It was like Inception, and it was just like you were just lost in grids. And if we had a very sort of fastidious, amazing second in department in science, and she was like, we need to do all of these assessments, and there were going to be 20 assessments through the year, essentially one every other week. And we were like, well, this is crazy. Like, we can't, that's like far too much testing. We're not actually teaching anything. But she was like, well, we just have to do it. Like, don't you, like, it's really unhelpful for you to say that. Like, we just have to do this. So just suck it up and we have to sort of get on with it. And that's a good example of how this churn just comes down the track and everyone's sort of scrambling to, you know, I think it's tied to the high accountability system that we have, that we just like, people have sort of got that mindset. They're like trying to not get in trouble, whether that's teachers with like not getting in trouble with their head teachers, or not getting in trouble with whoever, mat leaders, school improvement partners, Ofsted inspectors. You
always have to have something positive that you've done. What have you done? I've done this. So you need to be able to you know, articulate it, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's a final thing. I suppose there might be like a public sector, private sector thing here, you know, like schools aren't truly, we've got this sort of quasi marketplace, but actually most people don't treat the education system like a marketplace. They send their kid to the local school, more or less. And so there's that, you know, schools aren't necessarily incentivized. They haven't been historically. I don't know. I don't really buy into all that competition stuff, but there might be something in that, possibly. I don't know. But I genuinely, I find it a bit mysterious. But I think that fundamentally, to come back to that point about the two big reasons, number one is that teachers and school leaders aren't taught about this stuff for whatever reason. The people who wrote the MPQ frameworks don't seem to know about it. The MPQ frameworks have got a bit on implementation now, but they've basically just like cut and pasted the EEF framework and just bolted it onto the end of each MPQ.
And you know, I do a lot of work with the MPQs, and at the end of every evaluation, I don't think I've met a teacher yet who doesn't say that was the biggest revelation of the whole course.
The implementation bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And there's some good stuff, I should say. I welcome the EEF implementation guidance. I think it's a really good step in the right direction. And it's the most downloaded document from their website. And so it's clear that people know that they don't know this stuff and that they need guidance in this area. And as I say, there's some good stuff there, but also there's quite a lot that's missing, I think, from the EEF guidance. And it's essentially quite a high level document. Like there are four phases of implementation. It's quite a sort of high level conceptual framework, and it doesn't sort of guide you through the process with the granular detail that is needed. And essentially if that wasn't the case, then this book wouldn't exist. Like I won't go into a further critique other than to say that, you know, everything that's in this book that isn't in the EEF's guidance, I think is an important omission, and that actually there's more to it than that. And so I'm very hopeful that this book will help to fill that gap.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because, you know, what struck me most when I was reading it is that it is an absolute step-by-step guide, and you could take it and you could follow it, and it's really straightforward and everything is set out so clearly. And so I think that if you were a school leader and you picked this up, then you could sort of map out a year, 2 years, 3 years, and you would be able to go back to it. And I just wanted to pick you up on one of the things that comes up, I think, in conversations in schools. People want to see quick change, don't they? And you are really clear throughout, this is not quick. What would you advise to anyone who actually says, well, do I have to do this bit? Can I not just get on at part 2? Why do I have to do part 1? What would you say to them?
Yeah. So my initial response to that question is there are no shortcuts, unfortunately. But actually, as I'm saying that, I'm sort of thinking that's not necessarily true. So this program, as you just said, like this Making Change Stick program, and there's a program. So there's a website where people can access like a bunch of resources. We could maybe talk about that later that go along with this to help guide them through this process. And this is for like the really difficult stuff, right? So if you think about so one of the tools in the book is the priority matrix. So you've got, if you picture a graph with effort up one axis and impact across the other, and then you can sort of divide that into 4 quadrants. We've got high effort, high impact stuff, high effort, low impact stuff, low effort, high impact, which would be like quick wins, and then there's low effort, low impact, whatever, right? We're talking about that upper right-hand quadrant, high effort, high impact stuff. And that's things that are really difficult. The things that reoccur on a school improvement plan from year to year, closing the disadvantage gap, improving attendance, improving mental health and well-being, improving literacy and numeracy, reforming the curriculum, like really hard, difficult problems. That's the sort of thing that this program is designed for. But lots of the tools that are in it are super applicable to short-term, problems that you face. So there's a whole chapter on habit change, for example, which I think is absolutely huge. We could maybe talk about that. But essentially, people's habitual behaviors, that's the raw material that you're working with. Schools are very regimented places. People behave in very habitual ways. And so if you want to turn the dial on anything, you need to get under the hood of how habits work and how to help people change their habits. So that could be applied in lots of different ways to small things.
Could you give an example of that then? Because I know there are a couple of good ones in the book, and you mentioned wanting to read a novel as part of your New Year's resolution, and I think that's quite a good one. How would you go about, if you want to change a personal habit, what would you want to do?
Yeah, sure. So there's 2 frameworks that I found really useful. One of them is from the book Atomic Habits, very widely read book by James Clear, who's got these 4 laws of habit change. And then there's another framework that was developed that was quite similar, that was developed by the so-called Nudge Unit, the Behavioural Insights team that became a part of the government for a while under the Tories, and then spanned back out again. And they have this thing called the East model. And if you combine, but there's 2 of those overlap. So if you combine those 2 models together, you get these 6 sort of levers, if you like, which I don't know if I'm going to be able to remember them all now, but it's essentially to say, like, make that thing obvious, make it easy, make it satisfying, make it appealing, make it attractive, make it social, and make it timely. So like use timely reminders. And likewise, if you want to do the opposite of that stuff, if you want to dial down an undesirable behavior, you can do the opposite of those things. So you bury the cue instead of making it obvious. You make it unappealing, you make it unattractive, and so on. And so, for example, if you're wanting to encourage kids to go to attend after-school revision classes, to make it obvious, you might say, right, so everybody in year 11, all the teachers who teach year 11, 5 minutes before the end of the lesson, at the end of the day, can you just put this slide up and just remind people, just to make it really obvious, make it attractive? Is like, our maths club, we used to be called Cookie Club. So they're like, kids are hungry at the end of the day, I'm going to go and get a cookie. Make it social. So it's like, come along with your friends. You providing timely reminders that, we just saw an example of that. So you can see those kinds of examples. And likewise, if you're trying to sort of discourage lateness in school, to make it difficult, you might say, okay, if you're late to school, you need to go to the late office to record your lateness, but you need to do it at break time, right? So basically you need to do that in your own time. And so kids are going to be like, I don't want to spend half my break queuing up outside the late office, so I'm not going to be late, because that's like so you sort of find ways to introduce a bit of friction. And so there's quite a few more examples in the book of how you can use those levers of habit change to turn the dial on people's behaviors.
And I think sort of having an understanding of, the scratching the surface, of course, of the psychology about how people work, how people respond to stimuli, how people and organizations work, and sort of the levers within that. I think that's really important. And I should just say again, we are here talking about James Mannion's book, Making Change Stick, which is available from John Catt Bookshop.com, and you can go on there and you can buy it for yourself and read all of this great stuff for yourself. When I was reading it, there was a couple of things that I really liked, and one of them was the idea of a slice team. And I'm a great believer in, if you want to know what's going on in your organization, you've got to find like the grumpiest person, the lowest of the low, who feels overlooked, and find out how it is for them to be an employee in your organization, because that's where you're going to get the good stuff that it's really going to be actionable. So, how does a slice team work to kind of tap into a diversity of voices in your school?
Yeah, sure. So excuse me. The slice team, there are many ideas in this program, but the slice team is probably the big idea really that drives the whole approach. And it's the most radical idea, I think. And it's also the one that people really grab a hold of, and loads of people that I've talked to have started using slice teams. And before I explain what one is, I think it might be helpful to just give a bit of a rationale as to like the other big reason as to why the improvement rate is so low. One of them is that teachers and school leaders aren't taught about how to implement change effectively, at least not in a granular enough degree. And the second big reason is top-down change. We default to top-down, not just in schools, but hospitals, businesses, governments, pyramids everywhere you look, isn't there? There's a small number of people at the top of organizations who make the calls and make decisions on behalf of everybody else. And there are some instances where top-down change is really helpful, right? Where a quick, policy change will solve the problem and will move things forward. And two examples of that might be something like the smoking ban, the indoor smoking ban, and the introduction of seat belts, for example. Fairly easy like decision to make in the sense of policy. You just like pass the law, and then that's going to happen. And huge improvements in public health and so on. But when we're talking about those high effort, high impact things that I mentioned earlier, in schools, closing the disadvantage gap, mental health, all of that stuff, in the wider society, you could think about climate change and the social care crisis, and life expectancies going in the wrong direction for the first time in decades. And very clearly, the people at the top of those pyramids do not have the answers to those questions, or we wouldn't still be talking about them after so many years. And one of the reasons, there's many reasons that top-down change doesn't work. One of them is that people don't like being told what to do. Even when it's a good idea, there's just that sort of human nature, almost like an adolescent streak. It's just like, I don't want to be just this compliant little cog in the machine that's just politely doing what I'm told. I want to have some autonomy and agency. And that becomes apparent from very early on. Parents of very young children will know that like your 2-year-old does not want you to put their shoes on for them, for example. Right the way through into adulthood, there's lots of research on the importance of autonomy in the workplace. And I think perhaps the mother of all problems with top-down change is groupthink, which is this fascinating phenomenon whereby you essentially get bad decision-making as a result of unhealthy group dynamics, where people sort of come to value their place within this sort of prestige team, if you like, the senior team. They don't want to sort of disrupt that team. They don't want to be the one who's disagreeing with other people. They don't want to contradict their boss when they've just said something that they privately think, I don't really think that's such a good idea. So out of politeness, or maybe out of self-preservation, they bite their tongue. But you can see how the groupthink leads to bad decision-making. And that's the framing for this idea of slice teams. And this is an idea that I did come across in the implementation science literature, and improvement science. It's used there as well, where you take a cross-section through the organization and you get representatives of different types of people sitting around the decision-making table, not just as a consultation exercise. And we're having this conversation at an interesting time for consultation exercises. Let's not go down the Ofsted rabbit hole, but they could have done with reading this book before.
They really could.
Rushing through this consultation. I was thinking of just like tweeting out, there's a paragraph in the book and just tagging Ofsted. It's just like, guys, this is bad
Oh,
consultation.
do it.
And so so it's not just a consultation exercise. Essentially, that slice team becomes the executive that's tasked with overseeing this particular aspect of school improvement. And so let's say it's about, feedback. You're trying to improve feedback. So you might have a senior leader on that slice team, and also a middle leader, an early career teacher. So you're looking at it through those fresh eyes, or maybe even a trainee. Teaching assistants, helters, the Senko or Elenko if you're in Wales. Sometimes kids, parents, governors, site staff, whoever it is who's got a valid perspective on whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve. It's amazing what happens when you work in this way. Two main things happen. One is that you just get much better decision making because you overcome that groupthink and you look at the problem through these multiple lenses, and you think about this from the perspective of the Senko and the TA. TAs see so much stuff that we don't see. They have that child's eye view, but the adults sort of like understanding of education, as it were. And in the slice teams that I've worked with, often the teaching assistants come to really play quite a prominent role. So you get much better decision making, but also you get buy-in. You really overcome that sort of us and them dynamic where you don't want to do what you're being told to do, because you know that you're represented on this change team. You know that there's somebody like you with whom you can interact throughout the change period. And so you get buy-in and people come with you on the journey, and you harness all of this sort of goodwill and energy and intelligence and sort of problem-solving capacity of people to adapt these ideas and to make them their own. And one of the chapters is on tight but loose. So it's like what are the sort of the non-negotiables, but also what are the loose elements here, so that we can adapt this to year 1 compared with year 6, compared with a class that's got a different personality profile to this class over here. So use your professional judgment, but also we do need there to be some sort of consistency, so that we're not all just over adapting and it's all too loosey goosey, Go on.
So what I really liked is that one of the points I think you made is that, the leadership might have an idea about what the problem is that they're going for, but it could be the case that the slice team actually reveals a different problem that actually, does need addressing first. And so it's not just like, how do you think we're going to solve problem X? It's like, what problems do you think we've got? And hopefully they both notice the same problem, but they might not have. And that's really, I found really interesting.
Yeah, totally. And so it'd be a nice opportunity to mention, like, one of the exercises that we do early on in this process is called 5-minute interviews, where to go back to that feedback initiative, you might say, like, come up with a bunch of questions about that. What do you think about this feedback initiative? Do you agree that this is a priority for the school at this point in time? Or actually, do you think that we need to deal with other stuff first? What questions do you have? What ideas do you have? What concerns do you have, perhaps? And then each member of the slice team goes away and talks to other people like them, right? So the TA goes and talks to other TAs. Like you say, a representative sample, not just the sort of the ones who are preaching to the converted, but those people who might be, a bit more skeptical or perhaps even deeply cynical about what's going on. Middle leader talks to other middle leaders and so on. And then they feed that information back the next time the slice team meets, and they anonymize that feedback, right? So you don't say, oh, Kathryn thinks this is a load of nonsense. You sort of say, actually, some people are concerned about this aspect of what's going on. And also the slice team members can roll in their own views with this feedback that they're sharing. And so it's a lovely sort of safe mechanism by which you can have these very robust conversations about what's really happening. And again, often when I work with schools in this way, they say, we're not going to ever not do this in the future, because it's just, you really know what people are thinking. And often you get a very quick sort of like course correction when you do that initial genuine, safe consultation, that you're actually listening and you're having the robust conversations that you need to have when you're making decisions that affect lots of people's lives. There's often a quick like, oh, wait, we're thinking about this in the wrong way, or we're using the wrong language or something. And it's super, super helpful.
I really liked that. And another thing I really liked was this idea that there were strategies to engage the stakeholders in the slice team with the research. And you give a really nice way for people to find and read articles, which can be quite inaccessible.
Yeah.
And, I just want to link this to another question, which is, when you've identified your problem and you're going to say, well, we need to find out what the research says about problem X so we can decide what to do. Can you just talk us through how you kind of make that a less onerous task and a more accessible task for the people who will be engaging with that research? Otherwise, it can still be top down, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a chapter. Is it write a 1-page research summary.
Yes.
So right off the bat, it's like we've got to just fill a page. Like it's not a huge daunting thing, but it's essentially looking out into the world and finding like what is known about this activity. What is known about, for example, feedback, how to implement feedback, the timing of feedback, the format of the feedback, the nature of it, how long we give the kids to respond to the feedback, and so on. And so there's a few sort of guiding principles in that chapter. One is to say, like, park your hunches just for now. Like, you probably already have a sense as to what it is that you want to achieve here, but park your hunches, right? Just go into this with an open mind and be prepared to be wrong, because you might well be, or there might at least be evidence to the contrary that you need to take seriously. One of the guiding principles I borrowed from a fantastic book by Julia Galef called Scout Mindset. She's like, adopt a scout mindset, which is this idea where the scout in an army, the person who makes for the high ground and looks for the lay of the land and where's the nearest water source and all the rest of it, is contrasted with the soldier who's like in the trenches, sort of lobbing hand grenades around and what have you. And it's this idea of like just making for the high ground, and the scout mindset is like, what is an accurate understanding of this issue? Like, so let's actually go out of our way to find evidence that contrasts with what we currently believe, and we can weigh that and we can factor that in and just ask ourselves this question: like, are we thinking about this in the wrong way? Are we just being biased about this? Are we bringing our human cognitive biases to this process? And then the third guiding principle in that exercise is to spread the load, and you can do it really quite easily. If you let's say there's 5 people in a slice team, and you ask them each to review 3 articles. And when you read a review article, a research article, you don't read from the beginning to the end like it's a recipe for falling asleep. You just like skim the abstract. You look at it basically in the last 2 or 3 sentences of the abstract. It'll tell you if there was anything that's worth pursuing here. I would then jump to the last 2 or 3 paragraphs of the very end of the article, because if they have any bold claims to knowledge, that's where they usually put those. And so see if it ends on a zinger. If it doesn't, probably just discard that article and try another one, and just open up a bunch of tabs. And we sort of break it down in timing, but you can basically do that process. You can do 3 articles in the space of an hour easily. And that's 5 people times 3 is 15 articles. And then you just write like a little 3 bullet summary at the bottom and compile that into a 1-page document. And so it's very doable in a short space of time. And that's in a sense like engaging with research, engaging with published research. But really, most of the process of this program is engaging in research. We're actually implementing ideas and trialing them and collecting data, and then using that data. Later on in the book, there's a chapter called Pivot or Persevere, where we have these meetings. It's an idea that comes from the world of like agile business leadership and entrepreneurialism. Review the data as it comes in and think about this aspect of what we're doing. Are we getting this right, or do we need to tweak this? Do we need to pivot here, or do we need to persevere? And so you're continually sort of being agile and light-footed and continually orienting yourself towards the optimal way of doing whatever you're doing.
Yeah. And if I can pick you up on that, because that's something that I found really interesting, is that you talk about an implementation dip or slump. And in that chapter where you're thinking about pivot or persevere, it's about, well, how do you know if it's time to stop or change or to keep going because it's a dip and you think you're going to come out the other side? Or have you actually started to become guilty of you've got a sunk cost fallacy on your hands? And, there's a bit of a leap of faith, I think. How would you encourage teachers and leaders to hold their nerve when they need to and pivot when they need to?
Yeah. So there's no sort of ready formula for that, but there is a sort of a process that you can get the hang of. So you just mentioned the sunk cost fallacy, this idea that sort of when you pursued an idea for so long and you've invested so much time and money and perhaps reputation into this thing, you think, well, we're in it so deep now, we just have to keep digging. There's no way out. We don't want to lose face, as it were. And so there's a danger on that side, but the opposite danger is the weather vane trap, where you sort of where like you say, you start doing something, you enter into a little bit of an implementation dip, you lose your nerve, and you change direction like a weather vane in the wind, and that's the opposite danger. And so how can we walk the line between these two problems of the weather vane trap and the sunk cost fallacy? And essentially, to the extent that I have a formula, it's data times dialogue equals the correct outcome. And so as I say, data becomes a hugely important part of this process. So the School Improvement Initiative is what we often refer to as a complex intervention, right? It's an intervention with many moving parts. So if you're trying to improve oracy, say, I was doing some work with some schools around oracy this morning. They're looking at talk rules and sentence starters, and they were talking about something, I don't even know what it is. It was some technical terminology that they were using for children with SEND to help them to understand what it was, some sort of iconography thing, plus teacher training. There's probably about 8 or 10 different elements to what they're doing to improve oracy across the school. And so you would collect data on each of those things. So let's look at the way that talk rules are being used. Let's look at the resources that we're using to promote oracy in the classroom. Let's evaluate the quality of teacher talk between teachers and kids, pupil talk between pupils, and so on. And so you're capturing data on all of that stuff. And that probably sounds like a really arduous thing to do, but with the use of judicious sampling, just like, and also again spreading the load. So you're asking a bunch of different colleagues to capture a small amount of data. Just like ask 3 kids these 3 questions before, while the other kids are on task, or maybe at the end of a lesson, and just stick it on this spreadsheet, and you can capture a huge amount of data in a very light touch way. And then the team comes together and reviews that data as it comes in. But then there's a dialogue there, and there are a few models in that chapter for how you can have a dialogue using that data to think, well, what are we getting this right? Do we need to persevere? Do we need to pivot? And by the way, pivot doesn't mean just throw it in the bin and pivot to something completely different. A pivot could be a tiny little tweak. It could be a zoom in. So like something that is just a small part of what you thought you were doing. You're just going to zoom in and focus on that. Likewise, you can have a zoom out pivot. There could be a demographic pivot where something that you thought was applying more to boys in year 10, actually you want to focus on girls in year 8, or whatever it might be. There are all kinds of different ways in which you can tweak what you're doing.
And I think that's the message all the way through. And you give so many really practical strategies, and there's tables and there's protocols and there's worked examples for all of these things, so that a person who is following the framework can actually go, right, okay, let's try this, let's do that, here's what a good one looks like, for want of a better phrase. And they can actually follow it. And I think that really captures what you were saying as the gap that you are filling in between the high level EEF implementation cycle right down to you could pick this up and you could follow it over the course of a year, and there's practical things that you can do. Of course, we are talking today about Making Change Stick by James Mannion. I'll just hold it in the right place, and it's available from johncatbookshop.com, and please do check it out, because I think that this is a game changer. I really, really do. So just to move on, we've got maybe 10-15 minutes left. Let's talk about a couple of things I want to talk about. One is the problems, the problem-solving approach. What do you mean by that, and how is that connected to this? Because that's a really important part of it. Let's try and address the problems we've actually got, not the ones that we think are shiny.
Right. Yeah. So this is sort of a double-ended process, really. So there are these 2 chapters that I sort of think of them as almost like twins, but they're looking at different ends of the process. And so there's one called backward design, where you start with the end in mind. And so you get really specific. So that backward design is like a 3-step process where you sort of think, what's the difference that we want to make, for whom and by when? And you really try to make that measurable. So like we want to improve, we want to close a disadvantage gap, or we want to improve engagement. And then you go, well, what do you mean by that? Do you want to eradicate the disadvantage gap completely? Do you want to just reduce it? And if so, by how much? What is it now? What would be an acceptable gap for you? Is 5% enough? Do you want it to be absolutely zero? And so on. So you really try to get granular about what it is that you're trying to achieve, for whom, and by when. So that's the impact goal. Then you take a step back, and the middle process is like, what's the evidence that we need to collect in order to determine whether we've met that goal? So, what assessment tools do we need? What data collection tools, and so on. And then lastly, you think, what do we actually need to do more of or less of? The improvement strategy bit. What do we need to do more of or less of in order to collect the evidence that we're achieving that goal, right? Or moving in the right direction. So that's backward design, and that's like starts with the end in mind. And then there's this other chapter that goes with it, which is about conduct a root cause analysis. By the way, another staple in many, many other walks of life, almost unheard of in education, as far as I'm aware. And that's a very sort of problem focused thing. And there's a great activity called the problem tree, where if you just picture a tree, and the metaphor like explains itself really. Picture a tree. And so the trunk of the tree is your core problem. So it's like, this kid or this year group does not read books. They're not reading for pleasure. They're not reading really anything at all outside of school. And then you go to the branches of the tree and you're like, what are the consequences of that problem? And it's like, well, they have, an underdeveloped vocabulary, and they're not doing very well in their, formal learning because their vocabulary is limited. And whatever, they're underperforming in their exams, and they've got anxiety around reading, and lots of consequences of that. And then you go to the roots, and you're like, okay, so what are the root causes of why it is that the kids are not reading? And there are a number of ways that you can break that up. One of them is to break it up into like, what are the physical reasons? Is it is it like resources? Do they just not have books? Is there no library available? Is it that there's like nowhere sort of that's comfy, that where they can just relax and where they can sit with a book and it's quiet and they can actually just read either at home or in school? It could be like a human. It could be a human problem. It could be that there's nobody there to model it. There's nobody there to read with that kid. Or it could be like a policy problem. It's just like the school's policy isn't right yet, and so you can break down that analysis, and you can drill down into the root causes, and then that allows you to start to figure out where the solutions need to lie. Right? That's how you start to build that improvement strategy, because you're actually targeting the problem as it currently exists at its roots. And so then this whole program essentially is about how do you make those two things meet? So it's like having a really clearly defined vision of this like utopian vision of the future where you've nailed it. All of the kids are reading really, really well. People flock from miles around to find out how your school is so awesome at teaching reading and getting kids to read for pleasure. And then you match that with like the problems of the present, and you think, right, how are we going to get from where we are to where we want to be? And you kind of need to have both of those factors in play, really.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really powerful metaphor. And I think, one of the things that can happen, I guess, is that people might not really fully understand I think people understand what the issues are, but I think they might not always understand where the issues are coming from or what the blocks are and the barriers are. I thought it was really interesting. You're talking about the policy and, are we insisting, for example, that all children must only read 19th century, literature, well, they might enjoy Guinness Book of Records or something like that. So it's really interesting to really get to the core of what it is. No, thank you. That was a really good explanation there. When we're talking about anything in education, I think it's fair to say that a driver for us all, a moral purpose, is that we want to improve outcomes for students. We want to close disadvantage gaps, and we want to, increase outcomes and sort of give everyone the very best chance and start that we can to go on into their adult lives. I wonder if you can sort of say something about the outcomes of this process. You've worked with a lot of schools. Have you seen that happen?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So I think there's actually probably a follow-up book because I in this program, in this book, it was already sort of over length, and have some case studies of schools that that we could share. And there were a few examples in the book that are sort of mentioned loosely, but I think that we could go into that in much more detail. But absolutely, yes. So you know, there's a lot of examples that we could look at. I was working, for example, with a fantastic school in South London called Rathfern Primary School, where they assembled a slice team to help to overhaul their science curriculum, so that science was really sort of well sequenced, working your way all the way up from the school, from early years through to year 6. And again, you know, so they assembled quite a big slice team. It's quite a big school, so there was about 8 or 10 people on that slice team. Again, I really recall the teaching assistants taking a really leading role in that process. There was a national pilot in Wales, so there was an organisation which is about to become part of something else, but it was called the NAEL, the National Academy for Educational Leadership in Wales, and there were 9 schools in that pilot, and most of them were focusing on learner effectiveness, which is a huge part of my own work. That's that other book that I waved around earlier, Fear is the Mind Killer, also with John Catt, so it's on brand. I'm doing a really interesting project with the Welsh government at the moment around promoting learner effectiveness. So quite a few of the schools in Wales were focusing on that, with really, really remarkable outcomes in terms of improving outcomes for kids, in terms of, you know, exam results and what have you. I'll mention one more. There was one really interesting one, which was that I don't even know how they got hold of me. There was this couple of people from the Pacific Northwest of America.
Oh, wow.
Got in touch, and there was a history teacher and a librarian, and the school librarian had sort of started this project just because she was dismayed by the quality of the books, essentially, that were going through her hands and going out of the library. And she described it as, it feels like we're telling lies about Christopher Columbus to indigenous children. And that just, you know, doesn't feel good on any level. No. And so she was like, we need to go through this process of having a coherent, you know, historically accurate, representative, you know, history curriculum. And what does that look like? And then they started talking to history teachers, and nobody really knew the history of indigenous people or people of color in that part of the world. And so they got all these local historians in to start to talk to these history teachers about like the history of that area. And then they developed, and they secured funding from somewhere. And again, used the slice team approach, had lots of people. This was across a whole school district. So like it was in the tens of schools that were involved in that project. And it was really interesting, and it was so fascinating to see the way that this had come not from the usual suspect. It was interesting that that Lila mentioned earlier, change is not initiated by people who are classroom educators. This is a lovely example of somebody who's like at the chalk face, who's dealing with kids and literature every day, who's like, this isn't right. And they were able to access some funding and to run this training with me, and then reform the history curriculum across their district. And so, yeah, there are others that I could talk about. There are many examples, and I think I probably should write like a follow-up book, like a fieldwork book, perhaps.
No, that's really interesting. What I like about that second example in particular is that, you know, a lot of what we've said so far is to do with pedagogy, and actually that's to do with subject knowledge and substantive knowledge as well. And I think that there is a place for that, because I know from my experience, there's a lot of teachers who, you know, are so much they've come into the profession because of their sort of moral purpose to help children and educate children, but also because they really love their subject and get really excited about it. And, you know, sometimes CPD that is more pedagogical might be a bit of a turn off, because they'd rather go on a course and talk to other subject specialists and read books about their subject, because that's where their passion lies. And I think it's really good to see that this can be used in more than one discipline in a sense. And I wonder, we're sort of coming to the end of our time. I think we've probably got about sort of 7 or 8 minutes left, and I wonder if we can just come round to the idea of professional development and, you know, teacher training in general. What would you like to see? What's your long-term vision in terms of where we are now to where you want to be in terms of what it would look like implemented at scale as a way of working?
Yeah, thank you. So there's two levels on which this is a great question to end on, by the way, because this is really where it's at, right? Like professional learning. There's two levels on which we could answer that question. One is just like within this program, there's a chapter on like the role of professional learning in implementing whatever it is that you're trying to do in your school, feedback, mental health, whatever it is. There's probably going to be some element of some twilight sessions or some inset days or whatever it might be. And we could talk about that if you like, but I think the broader point is perhaps the most important one, which is like, how can schools take these ideas and implement them in a way where there is professional learning embedded in the process? And that's why I've developed this program that goes along with this with this book, right? Because when I work with schools, I basically facilitate the program, and I sort of share these tools with them, and then we have a little exercise and we discuss it and we apply it to their context. But whenever I do that, I'm basically saying exactly the same stuff. Just, apply it to your context is different. But there's only one of me, and there are lots and lots of schools out there. And I thought I need to get out of the way, and I need to find a way to scale these ideas far and wide. And that's partly what the book is about. But the book contains basically everything that I feel like I know about this world is in this book. And I do feel quite happy that even in the 6 months since the book came out, I beg your pardon, since I sent it off to the publishers, I haven't thought, I really wish I'd included a chapter on that. Like, I do feel like it really feels coherent as a piece of work, and I don't feel like there's anything missing. Having said that, I do expect my ideas to develop further as we move through the next few years. But so the program is really designed for a slice team, to go back to that idea, to form a slice team and then to work your way through this process. And the program is much more interactive. So, like, a book is not static. I beg your pardon, it is static, isn't it? It just sort of sits there on a shelf, and you might read it and make notes and stuff, but it's not an interactive, interpersonal process in the way that an online training suite can be. And so it's not really a course. It's like it's a program. And so there's a professional development. I beg your pardon. Sorry, it is the late show after all. It's been a long day. There's like a facilitator guide that gives the facilitator very detailed notes as to, like, watch this video, share this resource, here's some quiz questions, have a discussion, fill out this page in your playbook. There's a playbook. There's a video, one for every chapter of the book. So the book is totally aligned with the program. There are like data collection tools, and you can ask for top-up coaching if you want, and some people do. But everything that you need is in this program, which is much more scalable. There's a free taster course on the site. If people are interested, you can go to makingchangestick.co, and you can access the first 5 chapters are freely available. The other stuff isn't actually up there yet. I'm scrambling away in the background to get this finished off, and it's actually the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
Harder than your doctorate?
Way harder than doing a doctorate. Seriously, it's absolutely nearly killed me, because you have to make about 1,000 decisions about 1,000 micro things, and it's just super, super exhausting. But anyway, it's very nearly there. And as full disclosure, that is the full program is a paid thing, but it's very reasonably priced, and there's a sliding scale of fees according to the size of your school. So smaller schools pay very little, and bigger schools pay more. And so I'm hopeful that will become a vehicle for helping these ideas to spread far and wide. And essentially, it's a fantastic professional learning process for the people on that slice team to go through. Not only are you implementing that change really effectively in your school, but you're building the capacity of, like, essentially leadership capacity within your school. You're massively boosting the ability of people to implement change effectively in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I just, as I started to read it, I was just like, this is what we need. This is what we need. I've got one more question for you before we finish up, and that is to do with your lovely gecko. Can you tell us, please, why this lovely gecko?
Why the gecko?
Yeah.
Well, so I was stuck, right? Like, so I was like making change stick. You usually have some fairly clunky, obvious metaphor, don't you? And I was like, post-it note is a bit grim. And at one point, the publisher sent like a picture of a stapler, and I was like, oh, not a stapler. And I couldn't really think of anything. I was like a Velcro person stuck to a wall or something. And I was out for a meal with my wife, and we were in a tapas restaurant, and there was this lovely couple at the next table. And I think this was just on my mind at the time, and I ended up telling them about my book cover woes, and I was like, "What's sticky?" And the guy just went, "Gecko," and I was like, "Gecko." And so on the cover of the other book with John Catt, Fear is the Mind Killer. As you can see, there's an elephant who's afraid of this tiny little mouse down here, and so there was an animal theme. And it's actually quite hard to get a picture of a gecko that looks like it's stuck to a wall. Most of them just look like they're on the floor, but our friends at John Catt did a stellar job of finding one that does look very much like it's stuck to a wall. And so
it does look, and I like the colouring. I just think it's a really kind of aesthetic design. So that's really great. Thank you so much. We've been talking this evening about James Mannion's Making Change Stick, which is available from johncattbookshop.com, and there are plenty of titles for your CPD on that site. So please do check it out. James, thank you so much, and please, I appeal to educators out there, get a copy, give it a go. I really think it's a brilliant piece of work. So thank you so much for your time tonight.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.